I do want to start, Ross, with you and with what might be a deceptively simple question, but it turns out to have a somewhat complicated answer. But I think it's important that we start there. What actually is a pension?
Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Swiss Re and Swiss Asia Society, for organizing this excellent event. That basic question is where I always start when I'm looking at pensions policy. What is a pension? And because there is often confused thinking about pensions, I think it's important to start there, because the word pension refers, in my view, to what are two totally separate things. On the one hand, the word pension and the original idea of pension is effectively social welfare provided to make sure that people are not destitute when they're too old to keep working. And that's normally the kind of state public pension that is provided by governments to people beyond the age at which society thinks they can't work anymore. But alongside that, we have this other element of pension, which is effectively just private long-term savings. They are called a pension because they're treated perhaps in a different way and they're meant to be locked away for later life. But normally the private savings element wouldn't be considered part of social welfare. They're considered part of individual welfare. Now, during the last century, many employers stepped in and started offering private long-term savings vehicles, or straddled the social welfare element of pensions by actually promising lifelong workers that the employer would look after them in retirement as a reward for long working life. And on top of that, the individuals who maybe didn't have an employer pension, or for whom the employer pension promise might not have seemed sufficient, there was also the introduction of incentives to ensure people save in a private pension so that they weren't reliant wholly on the state, and also so that there was more flexibility for them if they needed or wanted some money in later life before the state would start paying. They would have that option. And that's the private savings bit, the private pension bit, which is, in my view, very different from the poverty alleviation role of the state social welfare element of pension. So what I think we are faced with when answering the question that you posed there, Nico, which is, who will pay for an aging population? I would argue that if you look at the framework of pensions, there are three separate groups who will pay for private pensions. And that leads on to this framework with three pillars. The first pillar is the state pension that I've described, social welfare, poverty alleviation. The second pillar is the employer pension, which seems to straddle pillars 1 and 3, where pillar 3 is private pensions. Some countries are no longer really looking at employer pensions per se. In other words, they don't offer a specific level of income in later life. They will be offering an investment fund, which people pay into and the employer pays into, and then depending on the investments, you will get some money in later life. And then on top of that, there are the private pension savings, which is the pillar 3, which is effectively long-term investments that are locked away with perhaps some tax incentives, because society clearly has an interest in ensuring, especially in an aging population, that you don't have more and more people destitute or in poverty or unable to keep spending much money as they get older and are no longer working or contributing to the economy via the labour market.
All right. Thank you so much, Ross, for this first introduction. I think this is helpful sort of as a framework also to keep in mind as we continue this conversation. Before we turn it to Yuwei in Beijing, let me just say to those people who've joined in the last few minutes this call, welcome. And if you do have questions that you would like our panelists to address later, you can post them at any time in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So the earlier you post them, the higher the chance that we see it and we can actually address it. So with that, Yuwei in Beijing, Ross showed us this framework of the 3 pillars. And what's interesting to me is that if you live in, I guess like most of us live in a country where this 3-pillar framework is actually applied, and so it is in China. Yet China's system has a few specialties and in a few ways works very differently from ours. So can you talk to us a little bit briefly about how the 3-pillar system in China looks and what makes it different from European systems? And I'll show your slides.
Thank you, Nico. First of all, I'd like to thank Nico and Asia Society Switzerland for organizing these events and also having me to the interesting discussion. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are connecting from. So yes, actually, just as Ross mentioned, so in Chinese pension system also feature the traditional 3-pillar model, which was recommended and promoted by the World Bank in the 1990s, but with some localization slightly. As shown in the slides, in China we have 3 pillars, but for the pillar 1 we have 2 components. The first component is called pillar 1A, which is a pay-as-you-go system with 20% contribution by employer. On top of that, we have pillar 1B, which by definition or by design is defined contribution schemes, but in reality, it's notional accounts. In other words, there's no assets, there's no real asset accumulated in this account. The main reason is because the local governments, they are using the money or the asset accumulated in the 1B to pay off the current pension debt. And then we have pillar 2. For the pillar, within pillar 2, we have 2 standalone schemes. One is called enterprise annuity, or EA in short. The other scheme is called occupational annuity, or OA. The main difference between the 2 schemes is the covered population. For the EA, this EA scheme mainly covers the urban workers, namely people working in the private sector, but in the urban area. And for the OA, the covered population mainly refer to the people working in the governments, in the public sector, for example, the hospital and the university, etc. And this scheme is, by definition, is voluntary. However, for the OA, it's kind of quasi-mandatory. And then we have pillar 3, the third pillar, which, as Ross mentioned, is kind of private pension in China. However, this scheme is very small in China in terms of the participant, the number of participants, and also the asset value. In addition to the 1A, 1B, I'd like to briefly, just mention in China we also have the NSSF, or National Social Security Fund, which is the sovereign pension fund or sovereign wealth fund in China, which is equivalent to the future funds in Australia and also all the government pension fund in Norway. So that's mean the established in 2000s, and now it's still in the stage of developing. Actually, that's NSSF is the largest institutional investor in China. So that's just the basic structure of Chinese pension schemes.
And Yuwei, could you briefly, before we move on, can you just briefly explain the difference between pay goal and defined contribution?
Okay. Yeah, for the pay-as-you-go or pay-go system, basically, I mean, the contribution is 20%, for example, in China, and also the benefit is almost confirmed or confirmed before you participate in the schemes. So you just pay the money, go there, and all the money will be put together to cover all the participants rather than related to any individual people. But for the defined contribution, which is different. So you contribute the money in your personal accounts. So when you retire, for example, in 30 or 40 years, your pension will definitely get from your personal accounts. So there's no any other money is coming to your personal account. I think that's the main difference between pay-go system and DC schemes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So. Like many other countries, so the elderly people, they have, they receive support from different resources. Apparently, pension is only one of the main income resource. So here we have two tables. For the upper panel, here we have, this table gives the main sources of income of the elderly about the age of 65 by location. By where you're from. You're from city, you are city dweller, you are the village dweller, etc. We can see there's some very interesting message here. For example, for the city dweller and the pension, I mean the elder people, they receive almost 60% of the income from pensions. Pension here mainly refer to public pensions, like I just briefly mentioned earlier in my previous slides, namely from the Pillar 1A and 1B. And the family support is also very important for the city and the residents. For all the other sources, they are not so significant. For example, labor income, for example, the unemployment benefits, etc., they are minimal. In contrast, for the farmers in the village, we can see that the family support, which is the largest or the major income source for the elder people living in the rural area. And the second most important source, as indicated in data, is labor income. I think that's very interesting. Actually, that's also is also Chinese situation. Many people, elder people, when they retire probably I was putting this, they never retire. So for the people working in the rural area, they will continue working until they are not able to work. So that's why labor income almost accounts for 30% of the elder people in the rural area. For people in the town area, so situation just lie in between. The lower panel gives the more detailed information by different age group. So for time constraint, I will not elaborate. So just for information, in China, labor income and the pensions and family support are three major income sources for the elderly. So now I'd like to briefly mention the last slides. So before I stop, so the pension asset in China, or the pension market in China, have grown very rapidly over the past 20 years or so. Here we have the data by different schemes. So Pillar 1A, Pillar 1B, and private pension, public pensions, and also National Social Security Fund, etc. Here we also have the resident pensions. So with this data, resident pension mainly refer to the pension schemes associated or which cover the people working in the informal sector. Yeah. But this money is very little, as indicated in my table. So in total, in 2019, we can see that in China, we have the total asset is roughly 12.2 trillion RMB. Based on the current, the exchange rate, which is roughly equivalent to 1.8 trillion US dollar. So that's mean that the asset in absolute value. And then if we want to look at the relative values, namely the asset relevant to the GDP, we can see that in total, Chinese pension market accounted for 12% of GDP in 2009, and half of the money they come from the public pensions. For the private pensions, which many refer to Pillar 2, EA and EB, the asset quite small, only about 2%. So, okay, I think I'll stop here to give some flavor about how Chinese pension system look like, how large the Chinese pension market is. So I'll be happy to take questions and interact with our audience.
Thank you very much. Yuwei, let me just ask one question right here, as you already mentioned this. So one challenge that you told me about also in our preparatory call is that China's system right now is too reliant on the public pensions. And I think we've seen this nicely in your last slide, that makes that the pillar 1A and 1B make out a big chunk of the contributions. Can you just briefly talk about like why is that a problem? You know, why do you feel that the Chinese system has a need to diversify into pillars 2 and 3?
So yeah, regarding the pension scheme in China, as I briefly mentioned earlier, and also you mentioned, Nico, Chinese pension system over rely on the public pensions. I think there are several reasons for this. So firstly, because in China, traditionally, the state, they play an important role in terms of the management and operation of Chinese society in general, and also particularly the pensions issues as well. So when Chinese government started to reform the pension system in 1990s, almost more than 20 years ago, at that time, basically China, we didn't have any formal pension system. At that time, the Chinese government started to reform the public pensions. Having said that, that means the central government and local government, they mainly rely on the public resources, including physical transfer, etc., to mainly focus on reform of the public pensions. And one of the reasons because the government wanted to make sure the people in China, the Chinese people, they can at least get some benefit from the public pension schemes. So that's, I think, the one of reasons. The secondly, I think the public pension, I mean, if you want to develop a more balanced pension system, private pensions and public pensions, etc., there are some conditions, particularly for the development of the private pensions, not in China and across the world, as recommended by the World Bank. There are some preconditions are needed. For example, there should be a good, capital market, for example, because for the private pensions, a big proportion of assets should be invested in the financial market or capital market. But back to 20 or even 30 years ago in China, the capital market was very little and was, underdeveloped. And also in terms of the supervision efficiency, for the supervision of the public pension, etc., and also require a good the supervision mechanism and the system, etc. And 20 or 30 years ago, that these kind of conditions were not relevant. I think that's the main reasons why back to 20 or 30 years ago, we Chinese mainly developed public pensions. Having said that, however, now I think the conditions are more ready to develop the more balanced pension system, and the government now indeed trying very hard to rebalance the different pillars in China to make sure the private pension can play a bigger role in terms of providing the benefit to the elderly people.
Now, if we compare this to the situation in Europe, Ross, how would you assess it here right now? Is it also, are we still in need of balancing out the system, or are we more at the point where we actually feel that the government or the state part needs to play a bigger role again?
Well, I think when it comes to the system within Europe, say, the UK has a slightly different emphasis than the rest of Europe. But the fundamental issue that, again, if you go back to policy in general on this issue of financing an aging population, is that the original plan for pensions and the three-pillar approach was developed pretty much during the 20th century. We're now in the 21st century. And when that system was developed, pensions were meant to last maybe 5 or 10 years. Indeed, the original pension age was beyond life expectancy. So it was more the system that we've got in China today in the rural areas, where most people just keep working and then they stop much later on in life. But now we've got a situation where pensions are trying to last for decades, because people are still, according to government expectations, expected not to have to work beyond, let's say, their mid-60s, but they're living much longer, which is great news. But then somehow or other, the money needs to be available to pay increasing numbers of people who are living longer as life expectancy keeps growing. And both China and Europe have aging populations. So there are issues here which I don't think have yet been factored properly into pension thinking globally. So, for example, I would say we need to start looking at people's lives. For me, pensions are about people, they're not just about money. So how do people's lives go, and how can we assure that there's money available? We talk about the first pillar, which is generally, as Yuwei described, pay as you go, which means today's contributions pay for today's pensions, but the promise is that tomorrow's pensioners will have money from tomorrow's taxpayers too. You could argue that with the kind of developments that we've seen demographically, the pay-as-you-go system is a bit more like pray-as-you-go, just hope that there'll be enough taxpayers to pay you what you are hoping for in later life. And I think to some extent, governments need to have the conversation about what is a normal working life, what can we expect people to do, or what can we encourage people to do? Clearly not everyone is well enough to work in later life. And in fact, many people don't even reach the minimum state pension age and die before that, having paid into the system, hoping to get one themselves. But you also need to encourage more private saving that can reflect the expectation of a longer life. And if you want to keep working part-time, maybe, that might be an option. I think there are a number of ways in which one can look at solving the problem, but currently just trying to jiggle around with the different pillars may not be sufficient, because perhaps one needs a radical rethinking of social norms for the 21st century to reflect the good news, which is that work physically tends to be easier. I'm not arguing that for some of the areas in China, for example, but they seem to be the ones that are working longest, and yet they probably have hardest physical jobs. But generally, work is physically less demanding, and people are fitter and healthier because of all the advances we've had in medical care.
Let me actually quickly interject a question from the audience, because I think it might make sense to briefly address this. It's for Yuwei. The question specifically is about China's one-child policy, which is no longer in effect, but which has been in effect for quite a long time. And of course, this has led to likely a somewhat lower population growth than otherwise could have been expected, which now some people say, you know, affects the demographic balance, which in turn affects the pension system. Yuwei, is it possible to quantify this effect? So you started talking a little bit about sort of the challenges of the system as well. Is it possible to quantify the effect of the one-child policy on the system right now and going forward?
Thank you for this question. But first, I'd like to clarify or update a little bit that the one-child policy or the one couple, one-child policy already ended about 4 or 5 years ago in China. So now the one couple allowed to have the 2 babies. So let's say put it this way. So this policy already one-child policy already ended. However, and take time to really to make sure Chinese population to pick up. Normally, it take 10 years or more than that. So indeed, the one-child policy already has some big negative impacts on the Chinese, on China, not only on pensions, for the Chinese society, for the Chinese economy, etc. Already had a big impacts. In terms of the pension issue, I think one of the big impact is on the fiscal side. That's because we know that in China we have different pillars, particularly for the pay-as-you-go system or the public pension system, which largely rely on the continuous growth of population, which require a bigger, younger population in order to make sure the pension contributions generated in the current in this year can use to pay the current pensioners. So actually that's one of the reasons why I referred earlier the pillar 1B system in China is empty, because in many provinces in China they are running pension deficits and they are using this money to pay off the pension debts. So I think this issue already impact on China and take time to really make sure the pension fiscal issue can be more sustainable in China. In that way, the China really to reform pension system, for example, to make sure the pooling level can be much higher than the current level. I didn't mention that because in China we have the 35 provinces, and each province they have their standalone pensions arrangements. So that means in some provinces they have the pension surplus, and in many other provinces they have pension deficits. So if China can really upgrade to elevate the pooling level from provincial level to national level, so in that sense, the financial sustainability could be less severe challenge for China. Gradually, hopefully, in the next 10 or 20 years, when the Chinese population pick up, the younger population can really pick up, and then the overall, in a long-term perspective, the Chinese pension system can be more viable and sustainable from the financial perspective.
And just to follow up there, and I want to ask both of you about this. One way of making sure that there's just literally more money in the system is to increase the investment performance of the fund. So all this money that we've in these funds, we've seen the numbers just for China before from you, Yuwei, this is a lot of money. So ideally you could apply that and create some good investment performance. You have already mentioned, Yuwei, that the investment performance from China's system is not yet great. It's underperforming many other countries. It's underperforming the OECD average. Can you briefly address some of the reasons why that is? So why is a system that has a fairly large volume of money in it not able to create the returns that it ideally would?
Yeah, indeed, in order to increase, the financial or fiscal sustainability of Chinese pension system, one way, is to increase the younger population. So as I just briefly mentioned, to increase, the fertility rate in China, etc. Another way to increase the pension fund returns. So that's a big challenge in China. Indeed, I think in terms of the total volume, the pension asset in China is very big. However, if we look at the issue from the relative perspective, which is not that big. So, Nico, can we go to the next slide? Briefly, then we can go to this slide. The next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, that's the relative. No. Yeah, previous one. Page 6, please. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, here is a chart comparing the relative size of private pensions in China with OECD and non-OECD countries. the green bar refers to the average, the pension asset at a percentage of GDP in OECD countries. This average is a simplified average, not a weighted average. If weighted average, the figure will be much higher. I think something like 60 or 70%. So even when compare this figure to China, China is only 3.2%. So that means the Chinese pension asset, as relative to GDP, it's very slow compared to OECD countries. So even we compare to non-OECD countries, which refer to the right-hand panel, and China is also, under performance compared to the non-OECD countries. So that's the first thing I would like to mention. So can we go to previous slide, please, Nico? The return. Yes. So in order to increase the fiscal sustainability of China, definitely China needs to develop the private pensions, and also China needs to increase the pension fund returns in China. Here we also have some comparative data between China and OECD and selected non-OECD countries. We can see for the pillar for the pillar EA scheme, the return in 2019 was about 5.4% in real term after inflation. And for the public pension, for China, the public pension investment return, the return is very, very low, even negative, below zero. That means actually the nominal return is below than the inflation rates. However, if you look at OECD average in 2019, the return was 7.8%, which is much higher than that in China. Either it's the private pension or public pension in China. And when we compare to non-OECD countries, Chinese performance is a little bit higher, but it still have room to improve in the future. So having said that, China definitely need to increase the Chinese pension fund returns.
And how would they do that? So what's the best way for China to get to that OECD level?
So as I mentioned earlier, the public pensions in China dominate in the whole system. We can say that the regulation is very strict for the public pension investments, which refer to Pillar 1A and 1B. For example, we can see the foreign investments is not allowed for public pension and private pensions in China. And so, and also equity investment at the upper limit is 30%. So if we compare to the many of OECD countries, for example, in the UK or US, Australia, mainly Anglo-Saxon countries, so the investment basically there's no much investment limits, except for some assets classes. But for most of the asset classes, there's no much asset limitation. So in this, definitely China, could improve in the future. For example, to liberalize the investment regulation in China. For example, to allow foreign investments, and also to increase, for example, the equity limit from 30% to a higher level. That's one way. And secondly, I think China will need to improve the pension fund management in China. Because in China, for the EA pension scheme, for example, there are 4 or 5 players involved in the whole management, which means less efficiency. So in China, in the future, probably we can more integrate the different market player or financial player in the management, for example, in order to reduce the fees or the management costs relating to the pension management. Definitely, there are many ways we can do to improve the pension fund investment in order to increase the financial stability in China.
I'm very interested to see your figures. There's so many questions I wanted to ask. One of them is that your Pillar 1A and B allows 135% in fixed income, so you are encouraging gearing in that pillar, which I found very interesting. And also, certainly outside the lesser developed markets maybe, pension funds are investing in a much broader range of asset classes than just equities and fixed income. And indeed, one of the ways forward, I feel, especially after the current pandemic, but in general, I've felt this for many years, is that pension funds, which are long-term pools of assets, could, and in my view, should be used to boost economic growth directly, not just to invest in fixed income or supposedly safe government bonds, or just standard equities in the equity market, but small businesses in building roads, investing in growth producing assets, investing in assets that can mitigate climate change, to protect other investments that these funds may be invested in for the very long term. And those are real opportunities for these pools of assets, which you're not mentioning. And I wonder if that is factored into considerations of pension reform. And indeed, there's a long way to go outside, within Europe and the UK. Some countries like Australia, Canada, and some states in the US have really benefited from a much broader diversification of assets and trying to use the pension funds to really generate growth. Quite frankly, given the rate of increase in life expectancy and the general demographics, unless you have really strong return upside, it's hard to see how the current pension expectations could possibly be met.
I think that's a fascinating conversation, and there would be so much more to talk about. In the interest of time, if you'll allow me, I do want to raise one more question from the audience, which is about automatic enrollment. So the question is that automatic enrollment has been a great success in the UK, and that's something Ross can talk to, whereas in China, there is a conversation apparently that this would impose too much burden on enterprises and incur huge costs. So very briefly, Ross, can you talk about automatic enrollment in the UK? How does it work and why was it successful? And then we'll put it to Yuwei to see whether that could be an option for China as well.
Yeah, automatic enrollment was introduced in 2012 following a long investigation about the best way to try and improve Pillar 2 of our pension system, the employer pensions. And it benefits from the insights of behavioral economics, which clearly have shown that many people, or most people, want to save and realize they need to save for later life. But the power of inertia is huge. And in the past, you were obliged to request to be in a pension rather than being automatically in one and having to opt out. Automatic enrollment means every single employer in the country must set up a pension scheme and enroll every member of staff earning above £10,000 a year into that pension and pay into it as well for them. And less, or 10% or less of employees are actually choosing to opt out of the pension scheme, which is a tremendous advance. So coverage of the private pension savings pillars has increased significantly. Adequacy has not yet. We need to encourage people to put a bit more away and help employers, incentivize employers. But that argument that we see in this question from Wang Zhuo was used in the UK for many, many years. People said you can't force employers to put money into pensions. It'll put too much burden on the enterprise sector. But we've done it, and it's worked spectacularly well so far, actually, much better than anybody expected. But it's only a beginning. These things take time, and we need to encourage higher contributions eventually as well.
Yuwei, just briefly, because we're nearing the end of this conversation, but so we talked about different ways of reform for pension systems in Europe and in China. You mentioned the diversification, increasing the return on investments. Would a switch to an automatic enrollment, which I understand is not yet there in China, also be an option? Is that something that you see on the horizon? If not right now, then maybe in 5 years, 10 years, that would happen or have to happen in China?
Yeah, automatic enrollment is a hot topic in China, particularly relating to the private pension reform. So from my personal perspective, I think this issue refer to which pillar or which scheme you're talking about. For the public pensions, I don't think we need automatic enrollments. However, for the private pensions, I think, for example, for the 401k or the nest system in the UK, automatic enrollment is good initiative. In China, we are working on this issue. However, for the time being, we're still in the discussion stage, because we really make sure, this reform will not, impose too much burden or cost to the sector, particularly to the private sector. As I mentioned earlier, the contribution rate in China is very high for the private sector, for enterprises. So if we impose another additional, contribution for the private sector, definitely that's not good news for the development of private pension in longer perspective, because they don't have much resources to contribute to the private sector. So we need to be very careful about this reform in China. Otherwise, probably we cannot achieve the idea of encouraging more people to contribute to the private pension schemes.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've already reached the end of this conversation for today. There will be so much more to talk about, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It will ensure that we can continue this conversation in other ways, in other forms. For now, Baroness Altmann, Dr. Hu in Beijing, Ross in London, thank you so much both for joining us today. Thank you all for having dialed in.